started. So good afternoon. My name is Melanie Turner. I'm the Director of Network Operations and Design at Complete College America, and I am thrilled to bring you the Digital Learning Success webinar series. This is a product of our HBCU Digital Learning Infrastructure Initiative that we've been working on for the past year. I will share the link to that project for you to learn more in the chat. But this is our first webinar. We have tons coming up. And so I'm excited to introduce our presenters for today. Our topic that we're covering is best practices for utilizing federal funding to support DLI. The topics for these series emerge from the work we did together in our HBCU DLI project. And so I'm honored to introduce Dr. Erin Lynch. She's the President of Quality Education for Minorities Network, and Mr. Terik Tidwell, who's the Director of Inclusive Innovation at VentureWell. They both served as advisory board members on the HBCU DLI project. So thank you both for being here, and I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Melanie. I'm gonna go ahead and pull up our slides. All right, Terik?
Go ahead, yep.
So good afternoon, everyone. We are excited to be able to present today on this topic. And I'll say we are excited because Terik and I are kind of homies in this space. So we actually met through the CCA project, and we have now done, what, 2 projects together, working on some major funding opportunities for the future. Because of the relationship that has emerged because of CCA. So we're super excited to be able to co-present together. So just some background into both of us. As Melanie mentioned, we have both served on or are serving on the Digital Advisory Board. My background in digital learning infrastructure really started as a digital faculty consultant for, I won't name the company, just because. And I started by researching the efficacy of their platform in pedagogical learning for pre-service teachers, and was the first person to actually do a national study on the effectiveness of that for pre-service teachers. And since then, done work for Titan Partners, Gates Foundation, in terms of equity design for digital learning platforms and digital learning tools, and just do a whole lot of grant writing and research over at QEM, which is this is a very exciting opportunity to have. So, Terik.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you kickstarted that, because I think we have very similar backgrounds as relates to digital learning infrastructure. About 10 years ago, I had a chance to, while working at an institution, I was actually working with a startup on a new ed tech that was really focused on revolutionizing, the sense of experiential learning. But that kind of like began the building blocks for over the time. Have done some work again with Titan Partners, building the Gates Foundation, and also supporting other institutions. Previously, I was at John C. Smith University, where I worked as the founding executive director of the Smith Tech Innovation Center. And then since then, I've moved on to VentureWell, serving as the current inaugural director of the Inclusive Innovation. So we're really excited about this presentation. Some really good best practice, some things that come from the field of both Dr. Lynch and I around experiences, things we've seen work, things we've seen, as scalable, things that you can look at as in terms of implementing, and also maybe adopting in some of your current work or programs and processes and policies.
We're missing a slide. So we had a goal slide. I don't know where that goal slide disappeared to, but the goal of this presentation really is to help you increase your awareness as to what resources exist on the federal level to be able to increase your digital learning capacity at your institutions. And so the outline of the presentation was, 1, we're going to discuss some best practices. 2, we're going to provide you some actual examples And then 3, looking at the planning piece. So what comes next now that you have this profound awareness as to what's actually out there? So, Terik?
Yeah, and in terms of best practice, some things that we've seen learn, which is always is collaborate with stakeholders to evaluate, the digital learning infrastructure assets. That means student, staff, potentially even people in the community who leverage or use some of the university's digital learning assets or for experiential learning or for educational learning. It's getting a whole pulse check on where is the institution and then conducting a gap analysis. What is our desired state or future state that we want to be in? And looking at that from a perspective of some building blocks to get there. Who may be identifying some strategic partners who can support the implementation of that desired state or some of the building blocks to get there. Always associating costs and seeing what will the cost for us to move in this direction, which is there's a lot of costs associated with implementing some kind of DLI project or protocol or policy, and ensuring that there's some level of senior executive leadership that can say, listen, we are going to have to innovate by substitution. What are we currently doing? How much does it cost? And if we move in this direction, can we use this new model that will pretty much make the old model, use that funding from the old model to match it with the new model? So always a sense of saying, how do we innovate by substitution? Because sometimes, we want to move down a road where, we're going to do one pilot and keep piloting, but we're not going to get rid of, something that is already ingrained into our system. We need to figure out a way to move away from current assets or current infrastructure to modern infrastructure, which requires some level of change management. So, of course, identifying federal mechanisms to support that service delivery. There's a significant amount of cash. We'll talk about that, which is what's the best funding mechanism to support some of these new DLI initiatives, some of these new DLI projects that you want to implement or your team may want to implement. Always meet with program officers, regardless of which agency that you're talking to. If it's an idea, they're really, in fact, there's a lot we'll talk about down the road, which is they want to be engaged in your thought process. Reaching out to them to get feedback is something that they encourage. So consistently, hey, this is what we're thinking. Here's where we're going. We want to see if this may be a best fit for this particular funding mechanism for this particular model. And so implement that feedback and apply it to that program. Some folks do not implement feedback. They want to do an idea that's their idea, but not do something that's in the best idea that meets that particular funding mechanism. There's ways of embedding DLI work into various funding mechanisms. And always conduct some rigorous evaluation of a pilot. Make sure that that pilot has a really good evaluator. Make sure that evaluator is also credible and also can support the dissemination to external audiences as relates to your current pilot or project. Next slide, please. Oh, I'll turn it over to you.
For whatever reason, it slipped out of order. So I've already covered this slide. So we'll go on to our examples at this point. There we go.
Go ahead.
So some of the examples that, and this is not an extensive list, of course, but some of the examples for some agencies that you might want to consider looking at opportunities for, and of course, include the Department of Education, the Department of Labor, National Science Foundation, and the Department of Defense. So these agencies we have found in our personal experience to be the ones that are most suitable for DLI related projects. Now, that's not to say that other agencies like Department of Energy, NIH don't have opportunities that could be tangentially related, particularly if you're looking at workforce development and biomedical or workforce development, energy sectors. But in terms of infrastructure and the components as to the reasons why we're using digital learning infrastructures, right, for learning, these agencies are ones that we have found have been most receptive to the types of projects that we want to present to the federal agencies. So, Terik, anything on this slide?
No, just in terms of just some of our, things we've tried in the past or things we've kind of launched and supporting. So, best practices, examples. I like the fact of Department of Education with its MISA program, which a lot of institutions do not think about that as a long-term improvement program. I've pretty much won 2 awards within that, which is Stack with Credentials and Active Learning. That is very broad and it allows for a significant amount of engagement, saying that we can embed, some strategic partners as well as DLI. And this is really about long-term improvement. And that program officer has been quite helpful and very beneficial to many of those who have applied and been awarded a MESIP award.
And I serve as an evaluator for a MESIP, but I won't say which institution.
Yep. Next slide. Okay. So this is something I wanted to point out because, there's just where can you find funding in uncommon places? Over the last, I would say within the last year, what we've seen is, these institutions, these are not your normal name brand institutions who are receiving upwards of $2.5 million where they're building in DLI infrastructure into their proposals. And it's coming through the Economic Development Administration. And people are saying, what, how, and where? Because EDA is one of the best kept secrets, but also something that institutions should be more mindful of, which is embedding or leveraging this funding mechanism as relates to supporting both the university and the community, which is, will this have a multiplier effect? And Phil Landers Smith College was awarded $2.5 million initiative to build a workforce training program, a facility to upgrade it, to upfit it, to put in a lot of infrastructure needs, broadband, anything to ensure that will have a kind of community spillover effect. And just recently, last week, Silver College received the same amount, I think $2 million, put into a similar center that will have a community component, serve the university, and allow for them to have access to this digital learning infrastructure. And these are just two recent institutions that are using this particular funding mechanism from EDA or Economic Development Administration. Next slide, please. Awesome. So this is a two-part piece, which is in the CARES Act. There was some funding that was relinquished or designed to support broadband infrastructure. One of them was support tribal broadband, which was a $980 million program, to now for that to be deployed, which goes to supporting distance learning, broadband affordability, and digital inclusion. This was really in rural areas. Also, the Community Connecting Minority Communities program. This was something that was new, that came out of a lot of HBCU advocacy work, I would say, MSI advocacy work to really support a very open mechanism to broadband adoption, infrastructure, learning, capacity building in this kind of area of digital learning infrastructure, and even to support minority business growth and development. More recently, with the Infrastructure Jobs Act, this is something that's coming down the pike, something that most institutions should be aware of or being engaged in, which is there's a digital equity competitive grant program. And this grant program has access to $1.25 billion that can be leveraged or may be leveraged in a way that you're supporting digital equity in your community, at your institution, and the communities that you're serving. So this is something which is, as you're doing this needs assessment, looking at ways in which, how can we use some of this federal funding or mechanisms to embed this into our growth plan or digital learning infrastructure growth strategy?
So one of my favorite departments, the Department of Education, is anything that is connected to learning, the department is going to have interest in. And so some of their consistent programs that we see where there could be opportunities for you include the MESEP, which we mentioned earlier. So this program is intended to help increase the workforce in STEM-oriented fields, but in such a way that it becomes sustainable for the institution and long-standing. So they're not looking for things that are just one-off pilots. They want to see projects that are going to make substantial changes to the institution and the institutional practices for its students in the areas of STEM. And so this could be an opportunity, the MESEP, to design a program that is STEM oriented, that will increase the capacity of your digital learning infrastructure, but also could examine some of the effectiveness of equity-centered design for digital learning infrastructure programs in STEM. So see how they have to kind of connect there to work it out. The SIPS program, we're all familiar with this one, those of us who are at minority serving institutions. We have for a very long time gone without thinking about how this program can increase the actual digital infrastructure. So oftentimes we use our SIPS funds, for deferred maintenance costs, right? Repairing buildings, hiring staff in our student success program areas. Those of us who are a little more innovative with our SIPS funding, create mechanisms by which we can increase research and capacity or R&D at our institutions using our SIPS funds. But we need to start thinking more in depth about how we can use these funds to really enhance those digital infrastructures at our institutions that will impact so many other areas. This last one is one that's a little known secret for the Department of Education and the Office of Post-Secondary Education. So the Open Textbook Pilot Program has been around for a while. And this is a program that explicitly targets institutions who want to explore what open textbooks look like. And where do we most often see that? Well, that's the hybrid flex model classroom. That's the flipped classroom model. And a lot of these textbooks obviously are digitally based. And so we have to have the infrastructure to be able to allow our students to access them, at all times of day and night. And so this is a program that could be tweaked, right? To allow you to build in capacity for your digital infrastructure to test out the efficacy of this with your target population. And Terik's favorite agency.
As I mentioned, the EDA. Again, I think the other part is EDA also has the broadband equity access and deployment program, which is separate from EDA Public Works program from the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. This is something that's with federal agencies, with the state agencies. So this is where it becomes, how do we become advocates within the state, which is working with the state, the governor. In fact, North Carolina, there was a visit from from the governor's office as it relates to broadband infrastructure, digital equity. Those conversations are critical and important because the state will be able to deploy that funding mechanism to support institutions, to support nonprofits, to support community-based organizations as it relates to broadband equity access and deployment and adoption. So being part of those conversations, it may not be directly beneficial to the institution, but it can be a force multiplier for what the institution is trying to do in or around the community, and also serve as a way of leveraging public policy to support some of the future engagements around digital learning infrastructure. Next slide, please.
It's one of my other favorite federal agencies. They just treat us so kindly. So I truly value. So there are a ton of opportunities at the National Science Foundation. Again, the mission of the National Science Foundation really is to strengthen and increase our STEM-oriented workforce, right? And so every project that you will write to the National Science Foundation has to have a STEM element. National Science Foundation believes that not only are the sciences, technology, engineering, and math part of STEM, but economics is part of STEM. Psychology is part of STEM. Human linguistics is part of STEM. So there are opportunities in linguistics to be funded as well. And so some of these opportunities are the ones that these are actually coming up for due dates. And then the one at the bottom, the EHR core, is an ongoing opportunity. So the Research on Emerging Technologies, Teaching and Learning, the RETL, this is a competition that really seeks to explore how emerging technologies are connected to our teaching and our learning practices, our teaching practices, and then our learning outcomes. And so this opportunity, again, looks at machine learning, AI components, the the elements that you would see in adaptive learning technologies in our digital learning infrastructures, and looking at efficacy of teaching and learning using those tools. The science of learning and augmented intelligences, again, looks at the same types of AI technologies and how those technologies are related to human learning for the impact in society, developing and testing new methodologies for STEM learning, research, synthesis, and evaluation. Again, very closely related to the previous two. This one is looking at how we can, just as it says, develop new methods for STEM learning research. And so that can include methods that are applied through digital learning infrastructures or LMSs. STEM workforce development, utilizing flexible personal learning environments is a little bit older, came out in about 2019 in response to a Dear Colleague letter akin to the previous one. And so this one again is looking at, has a focus on STEM workforce development. So how can we use our DLIs to increase our STEM workforce would be an area that I would suggest for this one. Research to improve STEM teaching, learning, workforce development for persons with disabilities. Now, this is an area that we often do not touch, not just at our institutions of higher education in general, but our minority serving ones, right? So we have our offices of disability services. Yes, we make sure that all of our students are provided access to the accommodations that they need for them to be successful in the classrooms. Yes, but do we take it one step farther and do we research what works best for our targeted minority populations who may also have disabilities? And so this is an opportunity, particularly in increasing the number of people with disabilities in STEM. This is an opportunity to research efficacy around those programs and digital learning tools that could support it. And then lastly, which is where we do not play a whole lot in as minority serving institutions, our EHR core. So any of our core opportunities at National Science Foundation, we are profoundly underfunded because we're not submitting nearly enough proposals to the core research opportunities. We target HBCU up, we target the teacups, but we are not putting in our good works to the EHR core research. And the core research is looking explicitly around human learning. And so there's an opportunity through the core that we can increase our digital capacity through submitting projects that will fund the infrastructural components, the equipment, but then also measuring the efficacy of the implementation of the new equipment and the new tools and software for our students and their learning in the STEM fields. So now that you've been made aware of all of these different opportunities that exist, and again, this was not an extensive or exhaustive list, we try to keep it within 30 minutes, a nice chunk of meaty time. Now that you've been aware of all these things, what's the next step, right? What do we do next, Terik and Erin? So you need to develop a plan. And so Terik mentioned this in the best practices at the very beginning. So now we're going to circle back around to this, right? And so he mentioned making sure that you are creating and establishing your cost benefit analysis, making sure you have the right people on the team, making sure you're having the right conversations to put policies and practice in place. And so this is very, very similar for that next step. You have to determine your need. Is your need the actual infrastructural components? Do you need the actual hardware or is it a software issue, right? Is it personnel capacity issue? You need to determine what the need is from the very beginning. Once you determine your need, then I would say to locate the resources and create what's called a resource acquisition plan. And so there's a template that we have for the resource acquisition plan that allows you to go through all of those best practice steps that Terik mentioned in a very structured, formalized way. And so it'll allow you to identify potential opportunities such as a MECEP, such as Department of Defense, HBCU capacity development grants, such as an NSF EHR core grant. And then from those opportunities, identifying what components of your needs could be covered. And this is kind of like when we're planning, those of us who plan I'm not one of them, but those of us who do plan like major banquets and those types of things. And, you want the food to be sponsored by one organization. You want, the printed materials to be sponsored by another organization. And then you want maybe the decorations to be sponsored by another corporation. And so this is kind of that type of plan, right? So having a plan where you can get the equipment covered in this one grant. You can get the software covered in another grant. You can get the evaluative tools and measurements covered in another grant. And so being very intentional about knowing what components you need to be able to locate resources for is what the RAP actually helps you to do. Then you develop your team to implement the RAP. And of course, just as Terik mentioned, with the other projects, you want to make sure you have a rigorous evaluation. You want to make sure that you're using iterative design to provide feedback to the RAP implementation. It's one thing for us to just put a strategic plan on paper and then never go back to that strategic plan until the end of the year to say, hey, did we hit all of our benchmarks? It's another thing to make sure we're using iterative design to look at it either on a monthly or quarterly basis, depending on how your institution prefers to operate, to know that you're working toward the actual goal of your resource acquisition plan and meeting your targets to get those resources acquired. So. And now we will move into some Q&A.
So, okay. So I want to introduce my colleague, Marian Vargas. She is our policy analyst and will be facilitating the Q&A and chiming in. So Marian, turning it over to you.
Hello, everyone. Happy to be here. I'm going to start by mentioning some questions that the audience had. So the first question that we have is to Dr. Lynch, and it is, you mentioned we aren't putting our good work into EHR core research. Could you clarify what you meant by that, please?
Absolutely. So we are profoundly underfunded in the EHR core and other core directorates or core competitions for National Science Foundation. I want to say the most recent numbers, or this might be NIH numbers. Those are NIH numbers, so ignore me on that. But from our federal agency partners, they are telling us that we are not submitting nearly as many proposals into the core opportunities. We submit profusely into the HBCU up, those of us who are at HBCUs. And as we should, that's the only competition that is specifically designated for HBCUs, but something that is worth being funded in the HBCU up program is worth being funded in the EHR core. And there is way more money available in the EHR core than in HBCU up. NSF has designated 8/100ths of its funding exclusively for HBCUs, 8/100ths. So that means that 98.2% of the rest of it, right, is over somewhere else, spread out somewhere else. And so we at QEM have been very diligent in working with the National Science Foundation to try to increase and encourage our HBCU and minority serving institution partners within our network to apply to the HR, because the way that NSF works is they evaluate off of two things: intellectual merit and broader impacts. And whatever is competitive in both of those areas in one directorate is going to be competitive in another directorate or another competition. And so we really want our researchers and our faculty and staff who are doing this type of research for National Science Foundation to consider applying to the core competitions as well.
Thank you for that, Dr. Lynch. Definitely a strategic way to look for resources. The next question is for Dr. Tidwell. Could you expand on what smart buildings and smart rooms are? It sounds interesting.
Smart buildings could mean anything from an IoT connected device inside of a building. It could mean you're having 5G infrastructure embedded, broadband brought into that building to ensure that those devices or applications can operate on that bandwidth. It can mean anything that makes that building up to standard, up to code, which could be, smart boards, anything that is part of education and learning facilities, servers, things of that nature. Could be your core infrastructure assets as related to like the bottom part of DLI. So it really goes into whatever you're trying to do and finding ways to make sure that it's part of that infrastructure, particularly if it relates to EDA. And most of your EDA state representatives will work with you on helping to outline what that qualifies as, or what that encourages, or what they can encourage you to do with that.
Thank you, Dr. Tidwell. So our next question. This is all obviously incredible, knowing all the different opportunities that these institutions have to pull from. However, it can be an overwhelming undertaking for institutions who do not have the resources or capacity to do grant writing and to dedicate time to exploring these resources. It looks like both of you were more than ready to answer this. But what would you recommend for those institutions, and what is a good starting place?
I'll start with that.
Okay,
Go
I'm
ahead.
ready. I'm ready. So you see, I am pro HBCU. I am hardcore HBCU advocate. I love my minority servings, but I am a girl who loves me in HBCU. I've taught it too. So 66% of my institutions have been HBCUs. So I understand the pain. I understand the pressure points that we have at our institutions. And what I would say is we have to leverage our networks. We have to reach beyond our institutions to other organizations. I'm just going to put a plug in, QEM, that does this work to be able to help support our institutions to submit these proposals. And that's from helping to find the opportunities, being able to navigate that process of communicating with the program officers, and then helping to actually write and submit the proposal. So finding the organizations outside of ourselves to bring additional capacity until it becomes the chicken before the egg type thing, until we can have our own capacity being built because we're writing consistently or because we're submitting consistently, is what I would highly recommend. I know a lot of our smaller institutions, we're doing a pilot study right now with 10 HBCUs as pilot participants. And one of the HBCUs has less than 100 faculty. And so we will be training 6 of their faculty, which is a very large percent considering 6% of their faculty will be trained in how to write competitive NSF proposals and serve on NSF panels. And we were very purposeful for that, right? Because we want to be able to do an each one teach one model so that we can start building in some intellectual capacity, intellectual knowledge capacity around these processes at our smaller institutions. So I would say absolutely reach out. I don't know if everybody can see the chat. I feel like because this webinar, it's mostly Q&A, but qem.org, our website, has our contact information. Please reach out so we can provide supports in these areas, is what I would say.
And I would encourage you to reach out to qem.org.
So that was interesting. Thinking outside the box, but really thinking
She frozen?
Broadband infrastructure?
Yeah, that's what it sounds like. I'm gonna go back to putting in one more plug for QEM. QEM is free, right? So that's the other thing. Like, we are supported by federal agencies. And so working with us to help you to submit your proposal, we can serve as a partner in the proposal when it's funded. So there's no necessarily upfront cost to that level of help. If you want targeted workshops, there is an upfront cost for that because those are much more in depth. But like, I'm working with 3 institutions right now to just submit proposals, and if funded, then QEM will be able to serve as evaluators on those proposals. But there are resources that you all don't have to necessarily put upfront money for to be able to gain access to. And I know for a lot of our schools, that discretionary funding pool is questionable, right? And sometimes non-existent. And so, so leveraging where you can get the in-kind services up front is a profound recommendation that I have.
Thank you. Hopefully I'm fully back. A question for both of you. How can PWIs support HBCUs in connecting with some of these grant opportunities?
Say that question one more time. How can PWIs?
Support HBCUs in connecting with some of these grant opportunities.
Yeah, I'm going to be transparent, and this is a safe space. So I'm going to say the PWIs need to approach our HBCUs as authentic partners in co-design. Oftentimes, what ends up happening is a lot of our larger PWIs approach our institutions as afterthoughts or as the diversity element on the grant. And when you have that type of approach, it comes through in the proposal, and it becomes very apparent as a reviewer, which I serve as many, many times. It comes through very clearly, and it doesn't score as well. So what I would say is, if PWIs are genuinely wanting to engage in this space to help, not even to help, to partner with our HBCUs, I would say to do so from a posture where it is co-design in nature, where you are in a listening modality to learn what the HBCUs really want and need, and then you all work as partners to create that that proposal together for submission.
Yeah, and I would just echo, one is definitely appreciating, the institution as it has its assets, moving from deficit-based language to asset-based language, because that shows up in the proposal, and that lets me know furthermore that this is not about an institution trying to help. This is an institution trying to leverage. So I think you want to do some work around how do we show up in an asset-based approach, or use an asset-based approach. And in some instances, what we have seen is some institutions or PWIs partnering with it's HBCUs or others, which is letting them be the lead and supporting in that lead capacity, right? Which is enabling them to leverage your infrastructure to develop their capacity to be the lead. Because it's, as we know, that HBCUs and these other institutions of higher education exist in an ecosystem. One institution cannot be the strongest. We have to ensure that there's mutually reinforcing institutions in the ecosystem, and that means that every institution has to be strong. So therefore, if there is a partner, it's really about enhancing the strength of the ecosystem, which means embedding or supporting the capacity of an HBCU from an appreciative lens.
I'm gonna add one more tidbit to that, because you triggered something for me. Even if the HBCU doesn't serve as a lead, make sure they get their full IDC. Make sure that the budgets are designed in such an equitable way that everybody gets their full IDC. And if that's complicated to do, then rework the budgets. But every consortium that we build at QEM, every consortium that I write proposals for, every team member gets their full IDC, because those are the funds that for us roll over every year as non-discretionary funds, or as discretionary funds, non-discretionary funds that we can use for anything. So you want to make sure that comes through in the budgets, because that is an element through R&D capacity building that is critically important for our institutions.
Thank you both. We have a CCA specific question next. So CCA also works with states and systems that want to integrate their digital infrastructure with larger student success plans. Most of our comments have been at the institutional level. How do we move to scale using networks like the CCA Alliance that includes many of the states where HBCUs reside?
Well, I would go to one is having a collective impact in the communities of practice, collective impact model and the communities of practice that can then begin to see how we can see how state policy that either enables or serves as barriers to some of this DLI work can be used and leveraged. So I think those are two different pieces, where one is creating a community of practice, and the other one is really looking at ways in which this is being formed, some of those different stakeholders. So there is some some really interesting things happening with state broadband, digital equity that I think that ties into DLI. And I think it's about how do we leverage the things that are already happening or have momentum to bring that into the conversation as like to student success, digital learning, et cetera.
Yeah, I have nothing to add to that one. Terik killed that answer, so I yield.
Amazing. So our next question is, how do you get buy-in from leadership and key stakeholders who might not see the vision or priority for the project? This definitely applies to just a wealth of higher education.
Oh, absolutely. I'm gonna jump in on that one. So I am recovering from the academy, right? So I just left the academy August, so last month. So and I would say the projects should be in alignment with the vision that the leadership has, right? And so it's good for us at the department and the unit levels to, yes, have our own visions for our departments and our units, but those have to be in alignment with our leadership. And when you have that, then you're not going to have a problem about buy-in, right? Because everything is synergistic, everything is connected. What we or what I have done in my previous roles and as a chief research officer to show the importance of R&D, for example, to our educational leaders is by just showing them the sheer numbers, right? The sheer numbers. So the institution where I served previously as chief research officer, we took our portfolio from 30 million to at its peak in the 3 years that I was there to 200 million. We then doubled our IDC returns, our indirect cost rates. We went from $250,000 a year to $500,000 a year in indirect costs that were recovered. And those are just funds that the university can then use at the department level, at the college level, at our administrative level. So the provost office, received a percentage, finance administration received a percentage, and the sponsor programs office received a percentage, as did our individual PIs, our department chairs, and the deans at the colleges, because we had a policy in place that allowed that. And so just showing the sheer numbers as to what is possible when you invest time and resources into R&D cultivation that can then bring digital learning infrastructure resources to the institution is a really, really important narrative to tell. I said this in a meeting last week at the HBCU National Conference in a mixed company between some corporates, nonprofits, and educational leaders, institutional presidents, that there's a stronger correlation between our R&D expenditures and student success rates at our HBCUs. And I tested that across IPEDS data with a random stratification, randomly stratified selection of institutions out of IPEDS. And it's true there too, right? So what we invest in R&D strongly impacts and correlates to our graduation numbers. And so when we're looking at if we're state schools that rely on our state dollars because we have some sort of performance mechanism for funding, then that's important, right? When we are a smaller school that might not rely on state dollars, but rely on external dollars to be able to support our institutional infrastructure, and then recruiting students, and then getting our donors to invest in our students because we also believe in our students, showing success rates through graduation, right, are one of those points of pride that we can say that our institutions have because we have a very special HBCUs. We have a very special population of students, historically marginalized and often socially vulnerable, and so being able to show the numbers is really, really important when you're trying to get I guess buy-in is the term, right? If you're trying to get buy-in for people to believe in an idea. But again, I go back to the very beginning, that idea has to be connected to the vision that's already in place for the institution, whether it's your mission, your new strategic plan, the plan that the president and executive cabinet have put out. So all of those things have to be connected.
Nothing more to add there. Thank you.
It looks like we might have time for one or two more questions. Next is, how do you plan for sustainability beyond the investment of the project?
Yeah, I'm going to tag team this over to Terik because this is actually one of the projects we're working on right now, right? We have got to look at how we can commercialize our work. We have got to look at how we can do tech transfer opportunities that create patents that can ultimately generate money for our institutions. And I'm going to yield to Terik because that is his area of entrepreneurship.
Yeah, and that's, you know, sustainability has to be baked into the forethought and vision of what you're trying to do. You know, always looking at ways in which how are we going to finance this from either a revenue increase or by a cost reduction. So one of the things which is how do we become more creative in financing or creative in some of our practices, or where is there a market where we can maybe distribute some of our learning, some of our intellectual property from the knowledge that we've created or the knowledge that we've been able to acquire from this process, or maybe there may be a way of rebundling what we know to use that to help finance or support what we're trying to continuously do. So this is really where you get very, really creative. And I think that's one of the things which is becoming more entrepreneurial for institutions to think about sustainability, strategic partners, a good you know, investment plan, and also finding ways in which can we use this grant to support the R&D efforts for us to commercialize it in 3 to 5 years. And therefore everyone, again, to what Dr. Lynch said, which is ensuring that everyone is getting still a piece of that percentage of the indirect costs that's going into supporting the, you know, the nest pool for institution. And therefore it's really just going to, you know, enable folks to consistently look for ways to innovate, look for ways that, hey, 10% of this is consistently come back to my department to support our initiatives. This is going to be great for us for what we're trying to do with launching new programs. We're trying to launch, you know, and hire new faculty members. This is where, you know, you can get things endowed in that space. There's also investments, right? I think, which is, you know, ways at which when you say, how can we look at, you know, this being monetized in a different market, whether it's in a regional market, whether it's in a national market, or even if it's in an international market. One of the most important, you know, in North Carolina, one of the most important exports is education, right? That looks very different. Federal laws have changed a little bit to allow a lot of different modalities for global education. So how is it that we can leverage some of the current legislation or, you know, current legislation to serve different markets abroad or even nationally? So I think it's really about being creative, being entrepreneurial, finding ways that you have the capacity to consistently manage and also to protect it, because intellectual property is one thing to have it, but it's also something to defend it. And that's where it becomes that much more precious if you're able to defend what you're creating in that position.
Well, I think that was a great note to end on, thinking of sustainability once we get all this done. I'm definitely walking away from this reassured in that there is a wealth of resources available to pull from, and that, you know, as you both said, a lot of support to do it successfully. As we move forward, I just want to remind everyone that CCA is here to help you as you take on these strategies. Honestly, the opportunities are endless. We can give you technical support. We can connect you to the networks that we have in this. We can teach you what we've learned from the HBCU DLI project. Just come to us, and we're excited to keep this going. Thank you so much to our speakers. I'm going to pass this on to Melanie.
I want to give a huge thank you to Dr. Lynch, Terik, Marianne. Thank you so much for sharing all of this information. As mentioned earlier, we will be sharing the recording of this presentation and the slide deck. We'll get it in an email. It'll also be on the CCA website. I also wanted to plug our upcoming workshops happening the rest of this week and a few next week. So join us tomorrow for a conversation on measuring what counts, DLI data, metrics, and the post-secondary data partnership. membership. And we have other topics throughout the weeks, and I will drop the registration link. But again, please reach out to any of us if you have any questions. I'm sure we're all more than happy to answer and support you in this work. Thank you for joining us today. Bye.